What if your addiction is not merely a weakness, but a language spoken by the deepest parts of your soul? What if, beneath every craving, every compulsion, and every moment of surrender, something within you is trying to bring into consciousness what you have spent your entire life refusing to see? Perhaps the darkness does not come to destroy you. Perhaps it comes because something buried within you is waiting to be understood. What if the thing you reached for was never really what you were reaching toward? What if, beneath every craving you have ever tried to understand, outrun, or bury in shame, there was a hunger that had nothing to do with the substance at all? A hunger so old and so wide that no amount of the thing you chose could ever have filled it. And what if the compulsion you were taught to call your weakness was, at its root, a misdirected act of worship, a soul that had run out of altars and begun consecrating whatever was close at hand? Carl Jung spent decades sitting with people who had exhausted every rational explanation for their own self-destruction. He was not incurious about the chemistry, not naive about the body's capacity to become enslaved to what it once chose freely, but Jung kept returning to a question that the clinical vocabulary of his era had no room for. What is the person actually looking for? Not the addict as a category, not the behavior as a symptom to suppress, but this person, in this particular darkness, reaching for this particular thing. What wound is doing the reaching? Jung gave a name to what he believed the addict was, in some subterranean way, pursuing. He called it the numinous. The word comes from the Latin numen, the trembling, overwhelming sense that something larger than the self has entered the room. It is the feeling that certain music leaves in the chest, long after the last note. It is what a person touches, briefly and without warning, in a moment of grief so total that it cracks the ordinary world open and reveals something beneath it. Jung believed that the human psyche is not merely a machine for processing experience. It is an entity that hungers, above all else, for contact with that which exceeds it, for transcendence, for the sensation of being, even for a moment, relieved of the exhausting weight of being only oneself. The uncomfortable cost of this idea is considerable. If Jung is right, then the person who drinks until the room softens, or who disappears into a substance until the voice in their head finally goes quiet, is not simply making a poor decision. They are answering a real call with the wrong response. The hunger is legitimate. The direction is catastrophically mistaken, and no amount of willpower addresses the hunger. It only addresses the direction. Perhaps what is hardest to sit with is the word worship. It sounds too large, too religious, too far removed from the ordinary despair of someone who simply cannot stop. But Jung did not mean it in any conventional sense. He meant something closer to this, that the psyche has a need, not a preference, a need, for experiences that make it feel briefly whole, briefly connected to something beyond its own isolation. When that need finds no genuine vessel, it does not dissolve, it goes underground. And underground, it becomes undiscriminating. It will consecrate whatever gives it even a passing resemblance of the real thing. This is what Jung called the shadow's thirst. The shadow, in his framework, is not simply the darkness in you, it is everything you have been unable to integrate, everything you abandoned in order to be acceptable, everything that was real in you, but found no welcome in the world you had to live in. The thirst belongs to those abandoned parts. The substance, it mimics the quenching. It offers the sensation of arrival without the destination. And because the destination was always something the psyche genuinely needed, contact, meaning, relief from the unbearable separateness of consciousness, the mimicry is convincing enough to return to, again and again, even as it costs more each time than it gives back. You were not broken when you reached. You were not weak. You were, perhaps, someone in whom the ordinary channels for this hunger had closed, or had never opened at all. Someone for whom the numinous had become inaccessible through any door that the world considered respectable. And so you found a door that worked, for a while. In the way that a door drawn on a wall works, you could almost believe you were through it. Imagine a well at the center of a city. Not a decorative well, not a tourist's well, but a deep one, sunk by a single person over years of labor, through rock and clay, and the kind of patience that no one witnesses because it happens before the city arrives. The city grows up around it. Families draw from it every morning. Children are cooled by it in summer. The sick recover near it. The well becomes so ordinary, so reliably present, that no one asks where it came from or what it cost to make. No one brings water to the one who dug it. No one asks if they are thirsty. The assumption is that the person who found water is, somehow, immune to needing it. Perhaps you have lived something close to this, not as metaphor, as the texture of Tuesday afternoons, of family dinners, of friendships where you were the one who held, and listened, and knew what to say, and where the conversation moved on before it ever circled back to you. The well gives. The well does not ask. And slowly, quietly, in a way you may not have named even to yourself, something in you began to go without. This is what Jung would call the unbearable weight of unfelt interiority. Not depression exactly, not grief in any form the world would recognize and accommodate. Something more like the accumulated pressure of a life lived largely outward, where the inner country goes unvisited for so long that it begins to feel like foreign territory, even to its own inhabitant. You became fluent in the needs of others and lost the grammar of your own. And the psyche, which is not patient forever, which does not simply accept the postponement of its own existence, begins to press. It sends signals. At first they are quiet, then they are not. The ache is real. That is the thing that must be said plainly, without cushioning. The ache is real. It is not self-pity. It is not weakness dressed up in introspective language. It is the legitimate hunger of an interior life that was never given the conditions to be felt safely, to be expressed without consequence, to simply exist without being immediately converted into usefulness for someone else. The pain is the sign of something alive, not something broken, something alive and unmet. And here is where the paradox opens, if you are willing to look at it without flinching. The compulsion, whatever form it took for you, whatever door it was not an enemy that invaded your life from outside. It was a response, a misdirected one, a costly one, a response that brought its own devastation. Yes, none of that is diminished, but a response, nonetheless, to something genuine. The psyche does not reach toward annihilation for no reason. It reaches toward relief from a pressure it cannot otherwise release. It reaches toward the sensation of interior space, of warmth, of the particular loosening that happens when the mask slips for a moment and something underneath breathes. That the substance or the behavior produced a counterfeit of this experience does not mean the experience itself was not worth seeking. The error was in the instrument. The need was not an error. Jung understood this with unusual precision. He did not look at the addict and see someone who had surrendered to vice. He looked and saw someone who had found a broken path towards something the soul requires. The compulsion, in his reading, is a call toward wholeness that has lost its address. It knows it is trying to reach something. It has forgotten, or perhaps never learned, what the something is. There is a difference between a person who drinks because they enjoy drinking and a person who drinks because, for a few hours, the static inside goes quiet and they can almost hear themselves think. The second person is not chasing pleasure. They are chasing silence. They are chasing a version of themselves that exists beneath the noise, quieter, more present, perhaps sadder, but real, in a way that the performing, the accommodating, the well-giving self has not been allowed to be. That self does not disappear because it goes unserved. It waits. And the waiting has a pressure to it. Not every hunger is an appetite. Some hungers are directions. In 1961, Carl Jung wrote a letter to Bill Wilson, the man who had co-founded Alcoholics Anonymous, and in that letter he said something that very few people who quote it have stopped to sit with long enough. He had treated a man named Roland H. years before, a man whose alcoholism had not yielded to any therapeutic approach Jung could offer. Jung told Roland, with the honesty of a physician who respects his patient too much to deceive him, that his case was essentially hopeless by ordinary means. But then he added something else. He said that in rare cases, a spiritual experience, a genuine one, not a performance of one, had produced the kind of psychic transformation that nothing else had managed. He used the Latin phrase, spiritus contra spiritum, spirit against spirits, the same word in two registers. The craving for alcohol, Jung was suggesting, is at its root a craving for spirit in the deeper sense, for transcendence, for union, for contact with something larger than the enclosure of the ordinary self. This is not a romantic excuse. Jung was not absolving anyone of the devastation that addiction leaves in its wake. He was doing something more difficult and more useful. He was pointing toward the origin. And origins matter because you cannot heal what you refuse to understand. Perhaps what you have been fighting all this time is not an enemy, but a messenger you never learned to read, a signal that arrived in a language you were never taught, through a door you were never shown, toward a room that has always been yours. How many times did you silence the ache with noise? How many times did you reach for the screen, the drink, the argument, the relentless work? Not because you wanted any of those things, but because the alternative was to sit alone with something that had no name and therefore no end. How many conversations did you fill to the edges, precisely because an empty conversation cannot ask you anything? How many mornings did you rise early, not from discipline, but from the fear of what the quiet might say if you gave it room? How many times did you confuse exhaustion with peace, simply because both of them, for a moment, made the noise stop? There is a face passing through your mind right now, isn't there? Or perhaps not a face, but a habit, a ritual, something you return to with the dependability of weather. And perhaps you have already noticed that the face changes, or the habit shifts its shape, but the returning never does. That pattern, the returning, the reaching, the brief relief that never quite holds, has a structure underneath it. A separate video in the pinned first comment explores exactly that structure, why the same ache travels through different containers. It is worth watching before you try to set down whatever it is you are carrying. But let us stay here a moment longer. Imagine a lantern, not a large one, just the kind a single hand can hold, carried by a person who has walked into a tunnel because someone, long ago, told them the tunnel had an end. They walk. The lantern is enough light for the next few steps, never more. The walls are damp and the silence is absolute except for their own breathing, which they have begun to count. After a time, the question is no longer whether the tunnel ends. The question is whether the light itself is the reason they keep walking. Not destination, not hope, exactly. Something closer to the need to illuminate whatever is directly in front of them, because the alternative is to stand still in the dark and discover that they are not afraid of the dark, which is its own terrifying realization. The compulsion is the lantern. It does not take you where you need to go, but it gives you just enough light to avoid stopping. And not stopping, for a long time, felt like survival. The question individuation asks, the question Jung's entire body of work is pointed at, is not, how do I extinguish the lantern? It is, what am I actually afraid of finding if I stop walking and let my eyes adjust? And perhaps that question, what you are afraid of finding, is not yours alone. Perhaps the people who watched you carry that lantern through the dark and said nothing, or said the wrong thing, or turned away entirely, were holding lanterns of their own, dimmer ones maybe, or lanterns they had learned not to name as lanterns. There is a particular cruelty in being surrounded by people who are also drowning and watching them mistake your reaching for weakness rather than kinship. But it is worth sitting with something uncomfortable here. The cruelty was rarely intentional. It was almost never personal. Jung spent much of his life thinking about what he called the collective shadow, not the darkness that belongs to a single person, but the accumulated weight of everything a family, a community, a culture has agreed not to feel. You inherit more than eyes and a way of holding your shoulders. You inherit the unfinished grief of people who came before you. You inherit their silences. And the people who could not meet you in your hunger were, in most cases, simply carrying the portion of that collective silence that had been handed to them. They were not withholding love out of malice. They were withholding it because they had never been given access to their own. This does not make the abandonment smaller, but it changes what the abandonment means. The person who could not sit with your pain was probably unable to sit with their own. That is not an excuse. It is an explanation that, if you let it, does something the excuse never could. It releases you from the story in which their failure was a verdict on your worth. Fyodor Dostoevsky understood this texture of human hunger perhaps more intimately than any other novelist. His underground man, that furious, humiliated, endlessly self-aware narrator in Notes from Underground, is not a villain. He is a man of uncommon sensitivity who has been handed no container for what he feels and has therefore turned his feeling inward, where it has curdled into spite and performance and the exhausting work of being difficult. Dostoevsky was not satirizing him. He was dissecting a type of suffering that emerges specifically when a person is too awake to be numbed by ordinary life and too unsupported to transform that wakefulness into anything but noise. The underground man's hunger is not for the things he claims to want. It is for recognition, for an encounter with another person in which he is genuinely seen. And because that encounter never comes, because the world keeps offering him surfaces when he is dying of depth, he settles for impact. If I cannot be known, he seems to reason, I will at least be felt. Irritation is a form of contact. Contempt, received, is proof that you exist. Perhaps you recognize something of that logic. Imagine a musician who discovers, very young, that music is the only place where what is inside her corresponds exactly to what comes out. Everywhere else, something is lost in translation, a warmth that arrives as coldness, a reaching that reads as demand, a sorrow that other people experience as burden. But in the music, nothing is lost. The interior and the exterior are, for a few minutes, the same thing. And because that correspondence is so rare and so necessary, she begins to play not when she wants to, but when she cannot bear not to. And then the music begins to change. It begins to serve the unbearable feeling rather than express it. It becomes a pressure valve rather than a language. And one day she sits at the instrument and realizes she is not playing anymore. She is evacuating. The music still sounds like music to everyone listening, but she knows the difference. What was once a meeting place between herself and the world has become a place she goes to be empty rather than full. Not because music failed her, because it was asked to do something music was never built to do, to replace the human recognition she stopped believing she could receive. The compulsion works the same way. It begins as an answer, a genuine one, however imperfect. Then it is asked to answer more and more questions it was never designed for, until the only question it can reliably answer is the question of its own presence. Will you be there? And it is always there, which is its final, saddest gift. Recovery, in the Jungian sense, does not mean dismantling the need that drove the compulsion. It means learning to take that need seriously enough to bring it somewhere it can actually be met. That last sentence deserves to sit with you for a moment, because it contains something the language of addiction treatment often overlooks. Most frameworks for recovery are organized around subtraction. Remove the substance. Remove the behavior. Remove the trigger. And there is wisdom in that, of course. The kind of wisdom that keeps people alive long enough to ask deeper questions. But Jung was pointing at something the subtraction model cannot reach, because subtraction alone leaves the original wound untouched, and a wound that is not addressed does not disappear. It finds another door. Individuation was Jung's word for the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, as distinct from who you were told to be, who you learned to perform, and who you discovered you needed to pretend to be in order to remain safe in the rooms where you grew up. It is not a process of self-improvement in the way that phrase is commonly meant. It is not an upgrade. It is more like an excavation, slow, sometimes disorienting, occasionally painful, in the way that returning sensation to a limb that has been numb for too long is painful, not because something is going wrong, but because something is finally going right. Recovery, understood this way, is not the erasure of the self that the addiction expressed. It is the redirection of that self towards something real enough to hold it. Perhaps this is where the language of willpower fails so completely. Willpower operates on the assumption that the compulsion is the enemy, that the self who reaches for the substance is a defective self, a self to be overpowered, shamed into stillness, replaced by a more disciplined version. But Jung would have seen that reaching self not as defective, but as desperate, And there is a significant difference between those two words. Defective things are discarded. Desperate things are listened to. Imagine a man who has spent 30 years maintaining a lighthouse on a coast where the ships stopped coming long before he arrived. He keeps the light running because that is what he was given to do, and because on the nights when the fog is thickest, something in him still believes a hull might appear out of the gray. Over time, the lighthouse becomes less about the ships and more about the ritual itself. The climbing of the stairs, the polishing of the lens, the turning of the mechanism at the same hour each evening. The ritual is real. The comfort it provides is real. But the ships are not coming, and some part of him has known this for years without being willing to let the knowing fully arrive. One night, a vessel does appear, not a ship but a small boat, carrying a single person who is lost and cold and asking not for the great sweeping beam he has maintained so carefully, but for a fire on the shore, something low and close and warm enough to navigate by. And he realizes, standing at the top of his lighthouse, that everything he learned to tend so diligently was built for a scale of rescue he has never actually been asked to perform. The help that was needed was always smaller, closer, more human than the one he prepared for, and the preparation itself, vast and disciplined and lonely, had become a way of not noticing that. The compulsion can function exactly like that lighthouse, built at some early moment to signal across an enormous distance, to reach something that felt very far away. Love, recognition, relief from the interior pressure that no one around you seemed to feel or be willing to name. The rituals accumulate, the tending becomes its own world, and the original signal, the original reaching, gets buried under the architecture of the habit itself. Recovery, in the Jungian sense, is not demolishing the lighthouse. It is walking down to the shore. It is asking what size of warmth is actually needed now, in this life, at this distance, by this particular person you have quietly become, while you were busy maintaining something built for a different emergency. This is what individuation asks of you, not that you become less, but that you become more accurately yourself. The hunger that drove you toward the compulsion was not a character flaw. It was a signal, misdirected perhaps, amplified beyond what any single channel could carry, but a signal nonetheless. And signals point somewhere. The work, the long and unglamorous and genuinely hopeful work, is learning to follow the signal back to its source, not to extinguish it, but to finally, carefully, meet it. So let the question rest with you for a moment, without rushing to answer it. What would change in the way you move through a day, in the way you treat the sudden quiet that falls between one task and the next, if you genuinely believed that the hunger inside you was never the problem, not the substance, not the distraction, not the relationship you leaned on past the point where it could hold you? What if the problem and the signal were never the same thing, and you spent years fighting the messenger? There is no urgency in asking that. It is a question meant to be carried, not solved. Some things open slowly. Some rooms in a life need the right kind of patient standing before the door will move. Perhaps what the compulsion was always trying to say, underneath every version of itself it wore, is simply this: you are larger than the life you have consented to live. I want to say something directly now, before we move further, because this channel exists for a reason, and I do not want to keep it invisible from you. There is a face in your mind right now. Maybe it is a person who was present during the years this hunger first took its particular shape. Maybe it is your own younger face, before you learned to translate the ache into action. Whatever shape it takes, that image did not arrive by accident. And if you watch long enough, you will notice that the same pattern tends to return wearing different faces, different names, different contexts, yet structured in a way that is unmistakably familiar. I have put a video in the pinned first comment that goes directly into that mechanism, why the pattern repeats, and what it is actually asking of you. If any of what we have explored together today has touched something real, that video is the natural continuation. There is a question I want to leave with you, not as an assignment, but as a companion for the days ahead. If the part of you that reached for the compulsion was not broken, but lost, what does it mean to go back and find it? And what would you owe that part of yourself once you did? I will tell you something briefly, in my own voice, because I think you have stayed long enough to deserve it. There was a period in my own life when I filled every silence I could find, not with one thing in particular, but with an instinctive, almost reflexive movement toward noise whenever the quiet got wide enough to say something. It took me a long time to understand that what I was avoiding was not emptiness. It was a fullness I had not yet learned how to hold. Jung calls this the numinous for a reason. It is not comfortable. It is not soft. It is real in the way very few things are real, and it asks something of you that nothing external can ask on its behalf. I am still learning to sit with it. I am still, in the honest sense of the word, in the middle of what this video talks about. That is partly why I made it. Thank you, genuinely, for staying. For being the kind of person who watches something like this to its end. That itself is a form of courage most people would not name as such. The video in the pinned first comment is where I would go next, if I were sitting where you are. It takes the pattern we touched on today and follows it one layer further down. If something in this reflection landed, I would ask one small thing. Press the like button, not as a gesture to an algorithm, but as a way of marking that this hour meant something. And if you are willing, write this phrase in the comments, in your own handwriting of the keyboard. I am not what I reached for. I am what I was reaching toward. Leave it there. Let it be seen. It is more honest than most things that get written in public. And if this channel has not yet found a permanent place in your life, the subscribe button is there, patient and entirely without drama, much like the work of self-knowledge itself. It will wait for you. It always does.